Yeah.
Your question was, I didn't really answer your question. You said, how did I get into comedy?
Yeah. How did you start?
How did I start?
What was the little inkling to make you?
So I was always funny as a child.
Mhm.
Looking back when my 20s, I used to think, well, maybe I developed it as a mechanism to kind of get along with the kids, to avoid bullying, that kind of stuff. But it just flowed naturally. You don't really think, you don't write things down. You're just funny. I say, always hear people say, oh, you should be a stand-up comic. You're going to grow up to be a stand-up comic. They would always tell me that. Now here's another story within my story. So how did I become funny? Well, I guess I got it from my dad. My dad was Puerto Rican, but I've never met my father. I never met him.
Mhm.
Now, one day I'm living in La Puente, okay, and I know you like La Puente because I heard you say that on one of
Oh
the
yeah.
podcasts.
They got
So I'm
good
living,
food.
yeah,
I know.
I'm living with my brother. About 20 years old. I'd never met my father. My brother, my older brother, is 20 years older than me. He'd never met his father.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's the dynamic within the family. And so I never had this father. So I'm living with him. And I just happened to walk by uh, his wife's like bedroom one weekend as they're inside there talking. So I just walked in and she says, she's asking him, she goes, hey, my first name is Mark, by the way,
Mhm.
Mark. And she says, Mark, I was asking Andy about his father, what he knew. And so he told me his name, what he knew, the little bit he knew. He says, what's your father's name? I said, and I only knew this because I'd gotten my birth certificate a couple of years before. And I
Mhm.
said, oh, I know his name is Pedro Montano. Okay. So that's all I knew. And then my brother was a mailman. He just happens to go, that's funny. He goes, isn't Pedro, and I knew a guy named Pete Montano that I worked with at the post office. Isn't Pedro the same thing as Pete? And I go, yeah, it is. Yeah. Pedro and Pete are interchangeable. It's American version of Pedro. And so then he goes, and it's funny because I worked with him at the post office and he retired a couple of years ago. And he goes, that's weird because he worked at the downtown terminal annex for the post office back when mom worked there. Our mom
Oh,
worked at the same spot 30, 20 years, 20 plus years ago.
right.
So it's like, that's fishy, right? And he's
Uh-huh.
going, well, okay. And he goes, you know what? He goes, now that I think about it, he's funny just like you. He's always making people laugh and he's a big joker. He's really funny. And then this is even more incredible. He goes, not only did I work with him, he retired, but I deliver mail to his house once a week. It's like,
This is your, oh my
yeah.
God.
So he's telling me about this guy and he's starting to connect all these dots in his head. And I'm just listening to this like, no way, really? Like, and then he goes, I think I have to talk to mom about this. And so our mother's never been forthcoming about, and none of us boys, because there's four of us, we never really asked her about our fathers.
Wow.
So I grew up that way and I just never felt like the need to go out and meet him. It was just I had this independence, I guess, that I grew up with. So
Mhm.
he says, I'm gonna talk to her. And he did. A few days later, he had the conversation, he shared it with me, and he said he was definitely him. And she admitted to having an affair at the time with
Oh
this
my.
man, Pedro
The
Montano.
mailman.
Yes, the mailman. She worked in the post office. Now, the dynamic there was that she started in the post office in the late 60s at a time when it was really tough. I mean, being a single mom, going to this, she said there was a lot of racism back then. The blacks and the Latinos didn't get along. And so
Mhm.
Pete, to her, was what she told my brother was kind of like he took her under his wing. She felt protected because he
Mhm.
had some status there where people respected him. He'd been there. She once got uh, threatened. Somebody told her, some man told her, an employee, mind you, told her, I'm going to kill you, little white woman. He told her like that.
Oh
And so
my
this was a
God.
very tough time for her. So
Right.
obviously they developed a friendship. It turned into something much more than that.
Right.
And so she never told him about it. She kept it quiet and just raised me. And I'm like 10 years beyond. So she was already 38 years old.
Uh-huh.
She was a mother of three at the time. And so, you know, then, my brother ultimately had to tell Pete about it. And so he went back to his house and told him, met him one day. He gets to his house and he's not there. And it was like, oh, he's told me that he wanted to get it off his shoulder, his chest, right? And so he was kind of disappointed they weren't there. But then after a couple of minutes, they showed up. And so he called him aside and told him, he said, as soon as he saw his face, he knew 1000% that this is Mark's dad, right? Like he knew.
Oh,
Any doubt
wow.
he might have had, he knew. He could just tell, just seeing him, his face, his features, everything. And he said, you're my younger brother, you're his father. So then it became this thing, and I had to wait a few weeks, and ultimately he gave me a piece of paper and said, this is Pete's number, this is his address, if you want to contact him, you can, you know. And I wish I could say that I did, but I didn't. I did not.
And you didn't.
I was 20 years old, and I didn't have any inkling of doing it. It just wasn't, you know, I thought about it for weeks, and I didn't. And, you know, my mom passed away 8 years ago now, and he was an older man than that. But from what I understand, at least I knew that I got my funny from him. That's where I got the funny comes from. It was just, it was sort of like genetic, I guess. And he was
genetic. Yeah. The personality, most likely.
Yeah. And so he has children out there. So I have biological.
Have you done the, I did the ancestry.com.
Yeah.
Have you done that?
I helped my niece once try to put together. She was doing it, and she wanted my help, my input from what I knew, because I had a tie to my mom and so a couple other people. So I used their information. And then I did go on a little rabbit hole to see about my father. I was more interested at the time. And from what I gathered, it's hard to kind of piece together who someone is because you see different addresses and stuff. But from what I could gather, he had already passed away. You know, so now as a 50-year-old man, I regret it. I do regret it.
You regret it. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess there's some siblings out there who, I'm sure if I showed up and knew them, they'd be able to tell.
What is your cultural background?
Mexican American. So my father was Puerto Rican from New York.
Right.
That was one thing. The other thing I knew about him was he was from New York. My mother's Mexican American, 4th generation.
Right.
In fact, we have a document that my great grandparents came across the border in 1905.
Yeah.
So they were moved to Arizona.
When I lived in LA, I remember I met like a family from San Diego, and they had lived in the same house before. They were Mexican American, but they basically have lived in the same house before it was the same house before it was ever even the United States.
Okay.
Like their family had not left that area, and they spoke todo español. Yeah. And they lived there, and they literally, their family like had been there right when it turned or something like that. Like they had never left the spot. So basically all of California is Mexico, you know.
Sure.
That's how I feel like.
Oh yeah, that's why you hear all the streets. Everybody comes over here. Everything's Santa this, and Santa Monica, San Diego. You know, it's all influenced by that. So yeah, in terms of like so I think that was where I get my funny from, but like in how I got started in stand-up comedy. It was something that people said I could do. I believed I could. I always think of like the story. I was one time watching the Comedy Store. They produced a show on TV. It was like, I believe it was a tribute to Richard Pryor. And they had Pauly Shore and a lot of the other comedians at the time, big names. This was probably 25 years ago. And I remember they had Jim Carrey on there, and he did some comedy, and he shared the fact that he said he remembers watching Richard Pryor on stage with his father in Canada, which is where he's from. And he remembers going like, wow, I could totally do that. You know, that's kind of how I've always felt when I seen comics. Like nobody, no comedian really inspired me to become one. I've always felt like that's something I can do.
Right.
Even though I'd have to learn the process and all that, but it was always something I felt in myself that I could do, but I was afraid of failure.